Fairhaven, Colorado, nestled at the base of the Rocky Mountains, was the kind of town where secrets were hard to keep. Its streets were quiet, lined with clapboard houses and picket fences that evoked an image of idyllic suburban life. But in Fairhaven, behind those picture-perfect facades, lay stories no one dared to share. It was a town where gossip thrived, yet the darkest truths remained buried, until Catherine Ellsworth's death shattered the illusion of peace. On a freezing February morning in 2023, Thomas Ellsworth returned home from a routine business trip to a silence he didn't expect. The house, usually buzzing with the energy of his wife Catherine and their 2 children, was unnervingly still. Snow covered the lawn, muffling the sound of his steps as he entered through the front door. The faint aroma of coffee lingered in the air, but something felt wrong, terribly wrong. "Catherine," he called, his voice echoing through the empty hallways. It wasn't until he stepped into the kitchen that his world unraveled. There, sprawled across the tiled floor, lay his wife. Her lifeless eyes stared at the ceiling, her once warm presence replaced by a chilling stillness. Blood had pooled beneath her, staining the pristine white tiles. A knife, slick with dried crimson, rested a few feet away. Thomas froze. His breath hitched, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman he had loved, the mother of his children, was gone. In that moment, the life he thought he knew crumbled around him. The perfect picture of their family, their carefully curated facade, was shattered. The police arrived swiftly, their presence disrupting the eerie calm of the Ellsworth home. Officers moved with precision, combing through the crime scene as neighbors gathered outside, whispering in hushed tones. Detective Lauren Mathers, a seasoned investigator with piercing gray eyes, surveyed the scene. It was immediately clear, this wasn't a random act of violence. There were no signs of a break-in, no evidence of a robbery gone wrong. The attack was intimate, personal. Whoever had done this had known Catherine. The discovery of her phone unlocked a trove of damning evidence. Text messages revealed an illicit relationship with a much younger man, Jake Reed, the 19-year-old son of Catherine's cousin, Lydia. The messages were intense, filled with longing, jealousy, and anger, a volatile mix that hinted at the chaos brewing beneath the surface of Catherine's seemingly perfect life. As the detectives pieced together the fragments of Catherine's story, another layer of the mystery unfolded. Jake had been living in Fairhaven for less than 2 years, sent to his aunt and uncle's home after a troubled past in another state. He was supposed to be rebuilding his life, but instead, he had plunged into an obsessive affair with Catherine, one that ended in murder. By the time the investigation turned its focus to Jake, he had vanished. The small-town tranquility of Fairhaven gave way to a storm of fear, gossip, and speculation. How had Catherine, a devoted wife and mother, become entangled in such a dangerous web? And what drove Jake, a young man seeking redemption, to commit such a brutal act? The town was left reeling, its tightly woven fabric fraying at the edges. The truth behind Catherine Ellsworth's death was only beginning to surface, but one thing was certain, Fairhaven would never be the same again. Catherine Ellsworth was the kind of woman Fairhaven adored, or at least thought they did. At 42, she seemed to embody everything the town valued: grace, family, and stability. Her days were a careful choreography of devotion to her family, packing lunches for her 2 children, Emma and James, keeping their colonial-style house spotless, and making sure dinner was ready when her husband, Thomas, returned from work. To the outside world, Catherine was the perfect wife and mother. But appearances can be deceiving. Inside, Catherine felt like a ghost. The rhythm of her life, once comforting, had turned suffocating. Her marriage to Thomas, though stable, had grown stale. Thomas, a successful contractor, spent more time on job sites than at home, and when he was there, their conversations revolved around bills, schedules, and the children. The spark that once defined their relationship had faded into a distant memory. Catherine found herself yearning, not for material things, but for connection, for excitement, for a reminder that she was still alive. It was during one of those restless summer days in July 2021, at a family gathering near Little Rock Lake, that she met Jake Reed. Catherine hadn't seen Jake in years. He was Lydia's son, her cousin's troubled 19-year-old. Recently arrived in Fairhaven after a rocky adolescence, Jake had moved in with his parents to start fresh. That was the official story. The truth was more complicated. Jake had always been different. Even as a child, he had a streak of rebellion that set him apart. By his teenage years, that streak had turned destructive. He'd been in and out of trouble, arrests for petty theft, fights, and eventually a stint in juvenile detention. Moving to Fairhaven was supposed to give him a second chance, but Jake didn't see it that way. To him, it felt like exile. At the gathering, Jake lingered on the edges, his dark hair falling into his eyes, his posture radiating a mix of defiance and vulnerability. Most of the family gave him a wide berth, their judgment palpable. But not Catherine. Something about Jake drew her in. Maybe it was the intensity in his eyes, the rawness of his emotions. Or maybe it was the way he looked at her, not as the dutiful wife and mother, but as a person, someone with her own desires and frustrations. For Jake, Catherine was unlike anyone he had ever known. She was warm and kind, listening to him without judgment as he vented his frustrations about his family and his life. She made him feel seen, and for a young man who had spent most of his life being dismissed or punished, that feeling was intoxicating. Jake began to idealize her, seeing Catherine not as his cousin by marriage, but as a beacon of stability and affection, a vision of the family life he had always craved but never had. But what started as a simple conversation quickly spiraled into something much darker. Catherine couldn't help but seek out Jake at other family events, finding solace in their quiet talks. Jake, in turn, began inventing reasons to be around her, showing up unexpectedly at her house or crossing paths with her in town. His attention was flattering at first, a reminder of the passion Catherine had been missing. But Jake's feelings grew deeper, and more dangerous, than Catherine anticipated. Meanwhile, Thomas remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath his roof. His days were filled with work, his mind occupied with deadlines and contracts. He believed Catherine was content, that their life together, predictable as it was enough. He didn't notice how distracted she had become, how often she stared out the window as if searching for something, or someone. For Jake, Catherine was the embodiment of everything he wanted but couldn't have. For Catherine, Jake was a fleeting escape, a way to feel alive again in a life that had grown too small. Neither of them realized the path they were heading down, a path that would lead to obsession, betrayal, and ultimately, tragedy. The seeds of destruction had been sown, and in the quiet corners of Fairhaven, they began to take root. The summer of 2021 in Fairhaven was unremarkable, much like the summers that had come before it. The days were warm, the evenings breezy, and the residents of the quiet town carried on with their predictable routines. But for Catherine Ellsworth, it was a season of awakening, an awakening she didn't yet understand and one she couldn't control. It began on a humid afternoon in late July. Catherine had stepped away from the noise and chatter of a family gathering by Little Rock Lake. She felt suffocated by the obligatory small talk, the children running around, and the weight of her own carefully crafted facade. She needed a moment to herself, to breathe. That's when she saw Jake. He was sitting alone on the dock, his legs dangling over the water. There was something magnetic about the way he stared at the horizon, lost in thought. He didn't look up as Catherine approached, but somehow he seemed to sense her presence. "Escaping too?" he asked, his voice low and tinged with sarcasm. Catherine smiled, surprised. "Something like that," she replied, sitting down beside him. They didn't speak for a while, the silence between them strangely comfortable. The sound of water lapping against the dock filled the air, punctuated by the distant laughter of their family. When they finally began to talk, it felt effortless. Jake spoke about his frustration with Fairhaven, calling it a prison disguised as a town. Catherine laughed, not because she disagreed, but because she understood. She hadn't thought of Fairhaven that way before, but his words echoed something deep within her. "I guess I never thought about it like that," she said, her voice tinged with melancholy. "But sometimes I feel trapped too." Jake turned to her, his dark eyes studying her face. "You don't seem like someone who's trapped." That single sentence lingered in Catherine's mind long after the gathering ended. She couldn't explain why it affected her so deeply, but it did. Jake saw her in a way Thomas hadn't for years, as someone more than a wife or a mother. For the first time in a long time, Catherine felt seen. Over the following weeks, their paths seemed to cross more often, though whether by chance or design, Catherine couldn't say. Jake would show up at her house under the pretense of helping with a chore or borrowing something for his parents. Catherine would find herself lingering outside longer than usual, hoping to catch a glimpse of him passing by. Their conversations grew longer, their connection deeper. And then, one evening in early August, something shifted. It was a family barbecue at the Ellsworth home. The air was thick with the smell of grilled burgers and the sound of laughter, but Catherine barely noticed. Her attention was on Jake, who stood across the yard, his gaze fixed on her. It was a glance, just a glance, but it carried the weight of something unspoken, something dangerous. Later that night, as the gathering wound down and the guests began to leave, Catherine found herself on the back porch. The noise inside the house was muffled, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Jake appeared, as if drawn to her solitude. "Nice night," he said casually, leaning against the railing. "It is," she replied, her voice soft. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them charged with tension. Catherine felt her heart race, the logical part of her mind screaming for her to step back. But she didn't. She stayed. Jake moved closer, and for a brief, electrifying moment, their hands brushed. Catherine pulled away quickly, her cheeks flushing. "We shouldn't," she stammered. Jake smirked, though there was a vulnerability in his eyes. "Why not?" The question lingered, unanswered, as Catherine retreated into the house. But the seed had been planted, and they both knew it. What began as fleeting moments of connection had started to spiral into something neither of them could control. By the end of the summer, Catherine was finding reasons to slip away from her responsibilities. A quick trip to the grocery store would stretch into an hour-long drive, during which she'd meet Jake in secluded spots on the outskirts of town. Their encounters were brief but intoxicating, leaving Catherine exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. She told herself it was harmless, that it would pass. But deep down, she knew better. For Jake, the thrill of being with Catherine was all-consuming. She wasn't just an older woman, she was his escape, his obsession. And for Catherine, Jake was the antidote to the monotony of her life. He made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years, even as she felt the walls of her carefully constructed world begin to close in around her. The affair had begun, and with it, a chain of events that would unravel everything Catherine thought she knew about herself, and about the dangers of crossing lines that were never meant to be crossed. As the leaves turned in Fairhaven, their once vibrant green now painted in hues of gold and crimson, Catherine Ellsworth found herself slipping further into a life she could barely recognize. What had begun as fleeting, stolen moments with Jake Reed over the summer had grown into something darker, more intense and impossible to control. Each encounter pushed the boundaries further, the line between right and wrong blurring with every secret meeting. By September, Catherine had developed an almost mechanical routine for concealing her double life. She'd kiss her children goodbye before school, feign errands or social obligations, and meet Jake in the secluded spots they discovered together, the woods by Little Rock Lake, the narrow trails hidden in the hills, or, on riskier days, the back seat of his car parked on the outskirts of town. Each moment felt like both liberation and imprisonment. She craved the thrill Jake provided, but with each passing day, the weight of guilt pressed harder on her chest. For Jake, the affair had become his entire world. He no longer saw Catherine as just a person, she was an escape, a symbol of everything he thought he deserved but had been denied. He was intoxicated by the idea of her leaving her life behind to be with him. Yet, as his feelings deepened, they began to twist. What had once been passionate desire transformed into possessiveness, and Jake's need for control over Catherine grew more evident with each encounter. "I hate it," Jake muttered one crisp October afternoon as they sat together in his car, parked at the edge of a dense forest. "Hate what?" Catherine asked, her voice soft but wary. "Sharing you. Watching you go back to him." His jaw tightened, and his fingers gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "It's not fair." Catherine hesitated. She had no intention of leaving Thomas or her children, but she couldn't bring herself to say that to Jake. Instead, she reached out, placing a calming hand on his arm. "You know this can't be forever, Jake," she whispered, trying to sound gentle yet firm. This is all it can be." But the look in Jake's eyes told her he didn't agree. His lips curved into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see." Back at home, Catherine began to unravel. The affair was no longer just an escape, it was a secret that consumed her thoughts. She grew distant from Thomas, who, absorbed in his work, seemed oblivious to the changes in his wife. At the dinner table, their conversations were hollow, filled with logistics about the children's schedules and household matters. Thomas, ever practical, didn't notice the way Catherine avoided his touch or how she stared into the distance with a look of longing, or dread. But her children noticed. Emma, 12 and precocious, began asking why her mother seemed distracted. James, only 9, clung to her more often, sensing an unease he couldn't put into words. Catherine hated herself for the distance she was creating, but each time she resolved to end things with Jake, the thought of returning to her monotonous life paralyzed her. Jake's behavior, meanwhile, grew more erratic. He started calling Catherine late at night, his voice a mixture of desperation and anger. On one occasion, he showed up uninvited at her home, standing in the shadows just outside her kitchen window. Catherine saw his silhouette in the moonlight and froze, her heart pounding. When she confronted him the next day, he brushed it off. "I just needed to see you," he said, his tone dismissive, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You can't do that, Jake," Catherine insisted, her voice trembling. "If Thomas had been home, if the kids had seen." "They won't," Jake interrupted sharply, his eyes narrowing. "You worry too much." Catherine wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew better. Jake was no longer content with stolen moments. He wanted more time, more control, more of her, and his frustration was beginning to show. The once tender exchanges between them were increasingly tinged with tension. Jake's jealousy bubbled to the surface in ways Catherine hadn't expected, leaving her both alarmed and unsure of how to respond. By November, the pressure had become unbearable. Catherine was constantly on edge, jumping at every phone call, every knock at the door. She had started lying not just to Thomas but also to her children, creating elaborate excuses to cover her absences. The web of deceit she'd spun was tightening around her, and yet she couldn't seem to stop. For Jake, the cracks in Catherine's resolve only deepened his obsession. He began to demand more of her time, accuse her of using him, and lash out when she couldn't meet him. But in his darker moments, his pleas turned menacing. "I gave you everything, Catherine," he said one night, his voice trembling with emotion. "If you're not with me, I have nothing." Catherine stared at him, fear flickering in her eyes. She wanted to end it, to pull away before it went any further. But Jake's words, his intensity, and the power he seemed to hold over her kept her rooted in place. She told herself she could manage it, that she could keep her two lives separate. But the truth was undeniable, the line between passion and obsession had already been crossed, and the storm was building. Neither of them could see it clearly yet, but their affair was no longer just a secret. It was a ticking time bomb, and it was about to explode. By the time the snow blanketed Fairhaven in early 2022, the once intoxicating affair between Catherine Ellsworth and Jake Reed had transformed into a storm of mounting tension and simmering danger. What had started as an escape for Catherine now felt more like a trap. The excitement she had once craved was replaced by dread, yet she couldn't find the strength to let go. For Jake, their relationship had become an obsession, one he was unwilling to relinquish, no matter the cost. Catherine's guilt grew heavier with each passing day. She could see the toll it was taking on her family. Thomas, as usual, remained busy with work, but he began to notice her distance. "You've been quiet lately," he remarked one night as they lay in bed. His voice was calm, almost indifferent, but Catherine felt her stomach twist. "I'm just tired," she replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. Thomas didn't press further, but the way he lingered before turning off the light made her uneasy. She knew she was pushing her luck. The lies, the secret meetings, the stolen glances, it was all becoming too much. Yet, the thought of ending things with Jake terrified her even more. Jake's behavior had become increasingly volatile. His once charming persistence now bordered on suffocating. He called her constantly, sometimes in the middle of the night, his voice oscillating between desperate and demanding. When she didn't answer, he would flood her with text messages, pleading, accusing, and sometimes threatening. One particularly cold January evening, Catherine stood in her kitchen, her phone vibrating incessantly on the counter. She knew it was Jake but couldn't bring herself to pick up. Her hands trembled as she washed the dishes, her mind racing. Just as she dried the last plate, there was a loud knock at the door. She froze. Peering through the window, she saw Jake standing on the porch, his figure silhouetted against the glow of the street lamp. Panic surged through her. The children were upstairs, Thomas was away on a business trip, and the last thing she needed was for Jake to cause a scene. She opened the door just enough to step outside, closing it quickly behind her. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I had to see you," Jake said, his breath visible in the cold night air. His eyes were wild, a mix of frustration and longing. "You've been ignoring me." "I can't do this right now," Catherine replied, her voice trembling. "You need to go." Jake's expression darkened. "I'm not some secret you can just hide away when it's convenient," he snapped. "You can't keep treating me like this." "Jake, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're going to wake the kids." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, Catherine thought he might lash out. But then his shoulders slumped, and his anger seemed to deflate. I don't want to lose you," he said quietly. The vulnerability in his voice tugged at Catherine's heart, but she knew she couldn't keep indulging him. "You need to leave," she said firmly, though her resolve was shaky. After a long pause, Jake nodded and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Catherine exhaled deeply, her legs trembling beneath her. Despite her attempts to draw boundaries, Jake's presence in her life only grew more consuming. He began showing up at her usual haunts, waiting for her in parking lots or near the grocery store. His jealousy flared whenever Catherine tried to distance herself, and their once passionate encounters became laced with arguments. "You don't care about me," Jake accused during one of their heated confrontations in February. "You just use me to feel alive, and then you go back to your perfect little life." "That's not true," Catherine protested, but her voice lacked conviction. She hated what their relationship had become, but she couldn't bear the thought of losing the one thing that had brought her a sense of freedom, even if it came at such a high cost. Twice, Catherine tried to end the affair. Each time, Jake's reaction terrified her. He would swing between pleading for another chance and threatening to expose their relationship to her family. The second time, he showed her a text he had drafted to Thomas, detailing everything. One button, Catherine, he said, his voice low but menacing. And your whole world falls apart. The threat hung over her like a dark cloud. Catherine knew she had lost control, not just of the affair but of her entire life. She became hypervigilant, constantly checking her phone, jumping at every knock on the door. Even her children noticed. Emma asked her one night, "Mom, are you okay? You seem different." The question broke Catherine's heart, but she couldn't find the words to reassure her daughter. Jake, meanwhile, was unraveling. His demands grew bolder, his anger more explosive. He began to speak of a future where it was just the two of them, free from the constraints of her marriage and family. Catherine dismissed it as fantasy, but deep down, she feared he meant every word. By the end of February, Catherine felt like a prisoner in her own life. She was trapped between Jake's obsession and the fragile facade of her family, both threatening to collapse at any moment. The affair, once a thrilling escape, had become a nightmare, and Catherine knew it was only a matter of time before something gave way. The chill of late February 2023 settled heavily over Fairhaven, with snow blanketing the streets and a biting wind rattling the windows of the Ellsworth home. Inside, Catherine Ellsworth sat alone at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. The house was eerily quiet. Her children, Emma and James, were spending the night with her mother, and Thomas was out of town on yet another business trip. It was meant to be a night of peace, a moment for Catherine to gather herself and think about how to end the chaos her life had become. But peace was a luxury she no longer had. Around 9 p.m., a loud, urgent knock shattered the silence. Catherine's heart sank as she rose from the table, dread curling in her stomach. She knew who it was before she even reached the door. Pulling it open, she found herself face to face with Jake Reed. His face was flushed, his breath visible in the icy air, and his unsteady stance reeked of alcohol. His dark eyes burned with a mixture of desperation and rage. "Jake, what are you doing here?" Catherine whispered, stepping onto the porch and closing the door behind her to avoid waking the neighbors. The cold bit at her skin, but her anxiety burned hotter. "We need to talk," Jake slurred, his words sharp despite his drunken state. "I can't do this anymore, Catherine. You can't just shut me out like this." Catherine crossed her arms, both against the cold and as a barrier between them. "I told you, Jake. We can't keep doing this. It's over." Jake's expression twisted into one of betrayal. "You don't mean that," he said, shaking his head. "You've said that before, but you always come back. You need me, Catherine. Just admit it." "No," Catherine said firmly, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "I can't keep lying to my family. This has to stop, for both of us." Jake's face darkened, his jaw clenching. "Your family?" he spat, stepping closer. "The husband who doesn't even see you? The kids who'll leave you the second they grow up? They don't need you like I do." "Stop," Catherine said, backing away. "You're drunk. You need to leave." But Jake didn't move. Instead, he grabbed her arm, his grip firm enough to make her wince. "You don't get to decide that," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I've given you everything, Catherine. You don't just get to walk away." Panic surged through her as she tried to pull free. "Jake, you're scaring me," she said, her voice breaking. "Good," he snapped, releasing her arm only to shove his way past her and into the house. Catherine followed him, her mind racing. She needed to get him out, but she didn't know how. Jake paced the kitchen, his movements erratic. "You think you can just go back to your perfect little life? Like I don't exist?" He turned to her, his eyes wild. "If I can't have you, then no one can." Catherine's blood ran cold at his words. "Jake, listen to me," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "You need help. We both do. But this isn't the way. Jake's laughter was bitter and sharp. Help? You think I need help? The only thing I need is you. In a flash, Jake's anger boiled over. He lunged toward the kitchen counter, grabbing a knife from the block. Catherine stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. Jake, put that down, she pleaded, her voice shaking. But Jake wasn't listening. His face was a mask of fury and pain as he advanced on her. You lied to me, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. You used me. I didn't, Catherine started, but the words were cut off as Jake lashed out. The first strike was quick, almost surreal. Catherine gasped, clutching her side as pain erupted through her body. She stumbled, her legs giving out beneath her, but Jake didn't stop. The second and third strikes came in a frenzy, blood splattering across the pristine white tiles. As Catherine collapsed to the floor, her vision blurred, she looked up at Jake. His chest heaved, the knife still clutched in his trembling hand, blood dripping onto the floor. In that moment, his expression shifted, from rage to something that almost resembled horror. Oh my God, he whispered, dropping the knife. What have I done? But it was too late. Catherine's body lay still, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. The warmth that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a chilling silence. Jake stood over her, his hands shaking as the reality of his actions sank in. For a moment, he was frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Then, panic took over. He stumbled out of the house, leaving Catherine behind in the cold, empty kitchen. The snow was still falling as Jake disappeared into the night, the streets of Fairhaven silent once more. But inside the Ellsworth home, the blood on the tiles told a story that would haunt the town forever. The morning of February 21, 2023, broke cold and gray, the sunlight muted by a blanket of thick clouds. Thomas Ellsworth returned home after a 3-day business trip, his usual routine of unloading his briefcase and calling out to Catherine interrupted by an odd sense of stillness. The house, which should have been alive with the hum of family life, felt eerily silent. Catherine, he called, his voice echoing in the emptiness. When there was no response, a faint unease began to creep over him. He walked into the kitchen, expecting to find his wife sipping her morning tea or bustling about preparing breakfast. Instead, he froze mid-step. His breath caught in his throat as the scene before him came into focus, Catherine, sprawled lifeless on the floor, her once vibrant form surrounded by a dark, drying pool of blood. The sight was so shocking that for a moment, he couldn't process it. His mind refused to believe that the woman he had loved, the mother of his children, was now gone. No, he whispered hoarsely, dropping to his knees beside her. His trembling hands reached out but stopped just short of touching her. Her eyes, wide open and unseeing, stared past him. The stark reality hit him like a blow to the chest, and a guttural cry escaped his lips. Fumbling for his phone, he dialed 911 with shaking fingers. The operator's voice was calm, detached, as he stammered out the words, my wife is dead." Within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of police cars lit up the quiet street of Fairhaven. Officers cordoned off the Ellsworth home as curious neighbors began gathering outside, their whispers carrying in the cold air. Detective Lauren Mathers arrived on the scene, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the grisly sight. She was no stranger to violence, but there was something uniquely unsettling about a crime committed in a home that seemed so ordinary. The forensic team quickly got to work, photographing the scene and collecting evidence. It didn't take long for them to identify the attack as deeply personal. There were no signs of a break-in, no stolen items, and no evidence of a struggle outside the kitchen. This was no random act, it was an intimate, deliberate act of violence. As they combed through the house, Catherine's phone became a critical piece of evidence. Detective Mathers unlocked it to find a series of text messages that painted a vivid picture of an illicit affair. The messages revealed an intense and volatile relationship with Jake Reed, a name that made the detective pause. Jake was Catherine's cousin by marriage, a detail that added a scandalous layer to an already shocking crime. "Find him," Mathers ordered her team. "Now." Meanwhile, Thomas sat in the living room, his face pale and drawn as he answered the detective's questions. His voice was hollow, his grief raw and unfiltered. I didn't know," he kept repeating, his hands clutching the armrests of the couch. "I didn't know anything was wrong." But as the hours passed and the details began to emerge, Thomas's sorrow turned to a simmering anger. The texts between Catherine and Jake were shown to him, and the implications were impossible to ignore. His wife, the woman he had trusted and built a life with, had been living a double life. Betrayal mixed with grief, creating a storm of emotions he couldn't contain. How could she do this, he whispered, staring blankly at the wall. But the answer wasn't coming. Catherine was gone, and the man who had taken her life was now missing. As the investigation unfolded, Jake's absence became the focal point. Officers visited his parents, Lydia and Michael Reed, but they had no answers. Lydia was distraught, her hands trembling as she clutched her rosary. "He came home late last night," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask where he'd been. I should have asked." Jake's bedroom provided more clues. Beneath his mattress, the detectives discovered a journal filled with disturbing entries. Page after page detailed his obsession with Catherine, his longing for her, his jealousy of her husband, and his growing desperation. The final entry, dated the night of the murder, was chilling: "If I can't have her, no one can." This journal, combined with the text messages and timeline, painted a damning picture. Jake's obsession had spiraled into rage, and that rage had culminated in Catherine's brutal death. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and the search intensified. The small town of Fairhaven was thrown into chaos. Whispers spread like wildfire as neighbors speculated about the scandal that had unfolded behind closed doors. Catherine, once seen as the perfect wife and mother, was now the subject of harsh judgment. Her affair with Jake was the talk of every coffee shop, every PDA meeting, every church gathering. But amid the gossip, there was a deeper unease. If something so horrific could happen in a home like the Ellsworths, what other secrets might be lurking behind the town's picturesque facades? For Thomas, the immediate aftermath was a blur of grief and confusion. His children, Emma and James, were brought back from their grandmother's house, their young faces filled with questions they were too young to fully articulate. Emma, on the verge of tears, asked, "Where's Mom?" The question shattered what little composure Thomas had left. He pulled his children close, holding them tightly as his voice broke. She's not coming back." In the days that followed, the Ellsworth home remained a crime scene, its warmth and comfort replaced by the cold sterility of police tape and evidence markers. For Thomas, the house now felt like a tomb, every corner haunted by memories of Catherine and the betrayal that had unraveled their lives. The stage was set for a reckoning, but for now, all that remained was the devastating aftermath of a love that had turned deadly and the unanswered question of where Jake had fled, and what he might do next. By June 2023, the small town of Fairhaven was consumed by the trial of Jake Reed. The courthouse became a stage for a drama that had unraveled behind closed doors but now spilled into public view. Neighbors who once exchanged polite smiles now gathered in the gallery, their expressions a mix of curiosity, disbelief, and grim fascination. For weeks, the headlines had painted a sordid picture of betrayal, obsession, and violence. Now, the courtroom promised answers, or so everyone hoped. Jake had been apprehended in late February, hiding in a dingy motel on the outskirts of Denver. When officers arrested him, he didn't resist. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, as though he had already resigned himself to his fate. The journal found in his room sealed the narrative. Jake's infatuation with Catherine had spiraled into a deadly obsession. The trial began with somber formalities. Catherine's family sat in the front row, Thomas Ellsworth stiff and silent, his jaw clenched tightly as he listened to the prosecutor's opening statement. Beside him, Emma and James were absent. They had been shielded from the gruesome details, but Catherine's mother sat with a tissue clutched in her hand, dabbing at her eyes. On the other side of the courtroom, Lydia and Michael Reed, Jake's parents, sat huddled together, their grief evident. Lydia couldn't meet Thomas's gaze. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the damning evidence. The text messages between Catherine and Jake were displayed on a large screen, their words read aloud by the lead prosecutor. The gallery shifted uncomfortably as the messages painted a vivid picture of their relationship, passionate at first, but increasingly volatile as Jake's jealousy and possessiveness took hold. Then came the journal. This journal, the prosecutor said, holding it aloft for the jury to see, is not just a record of Mr. Reed's thoughts. It is a chilling roadmap to murder. Excerpts were read aloud, each word dripping with desperation and rage. Phrases like, "She belongs to me," and, "If I can't have her, no one will," echoed through the courtroom. Jake sat motionless at the defense table, his face a mask of indifference, but his fingers fidgeted with a pen, betraying his unease. The defense attempted to shift the narrative, portraying Jake as a troubled young man with a history of neglect and trauma. His attorney argued that Catherine, an older and more experienced woman, had manipulated Jake into the affair, using him to escape her unhappy marriage. It was a desperate attempt to deflect blame, but the evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from forensic psychologists painted Jake as someone with obsessive tendencies, unable to cope with rejection. His relationship with Mrs. Ellsworth was not one of mutual respect or love, one expert stated. It was marked by control and dependency, which, when threatened, culminated in violence. But the most shocking moment came when the prosecution introduced a witness the town hadn't expected, Catherine's therapist. She testified that Catherine had sought help in January 2023, desperate to find a way out of the affair without destroying her family. She was terrified of Jacob's reaction, the therapist revealed. She told me he had begun making threats, and she feared what he might do if she tried to end things. The gallery erupted in whispers, and the weight of Catherine's predicament settled heavily over the room. Thomas's face remained stoic, but his hands gripped the bench so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He hadn't known. All this time, he had thought Catherine's distance was born of disinterest or dissatisfaction, but now he saw the fear she had carried alone. Jake's defense faltered further when the detectives who had interrogated him took the stand. They recounted his initial denials, followed by a chilling moment of clarity when he finally confessed. "I loved her," Jake had said during the interview, his voice cracking. "She said she loved me too, but she lied. She was going to leave me." The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the jury needed only a few hours to reach a verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The foreperson stood, cleared their throat, and delivered the words the Ellsworth family had waited months to hear. Guilty of second-degree murder. Jake didn't flinch as the verdict was read. His eyes remained fixed on the table in front of him, his expression unreadable. Thomas, meanwhile, exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't closure, nothing could bring Catherine back, but it was justice. At least now, the man who had taken her life would spend the rest of his behind bars. The sentencing came a week later, life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Jake was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his parents wept silently, their grief a mirror image of the Ellsworth family's pain. The town of Fairhaven, which had spent months reeling from the scandal, now found itself grappling with the aftermath. The trial didn't just expose Jake's crime, it revealed the cracks in Fairhaven's veneer. The neighbors who had once idolized Catherine now spoke of her in hushed tones, their admiration tempered by the revelations of her affair. For Thomas, the trial was both an ending and a beginning. It marked the conclusion of a chapter defined by betrayal and loss, but it also left him to face a future he hadn't chosen, raising Emma and James alone, piecing together a life from the ruins Jake had left behind. In the end, the trial offered answers, but no resolution. The people of Fairhaven would never forget Catherine Ellsworth or the man who claimed to love her enough to kill her. Months after the trial of Jake Reed, the town of Fairhaven began to settle back into its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. Snow had melted into spring rains, and the streets buzzed with activity, but the shadow of Catherine Ellsworth's murder still lingered. It wasn't the kind of story people forgot. Whispers followed the Ellsworth family wherever they went, and the scars left behind by the tragedy remained raw. For Thomas Ellsworth, the weight of Catherine's betrayal was almost as unbearable as her death. He had spent years believing their marriage, though imperfect, was steady and reliable. Learning about her affair with Jake had shattered that illusion, and no amount of time or distance could erase the image of her secret texts or the sordid details revealed during the trial. Yet, alongside the anger was a profound grief for the woman he had once loved, for the life they had built together, and for the questions that would never be answered. Thomas tried to keep life as normal as possible for Emma and James, but nothing about their world was normal anymore. Their home, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and heavy, its walls bearing witness to the unspeakable events that had unfolded. Thomas thought about selling the house, moving somewhere new, but the thought of uprooting his children from the only home they'd ever known felt too cruel. So, he stayed, navigating each day as best he could. Emma, 12, had grown unusually quiet since her mother's death. Always observant, she had pieced together more than Thomas realized, overhearing fragments of conversations and catching glimpses of the trial on the news. At school, she felt the stares of her classmates and the whispers that followed her down the halls. The weight of her mother's choices, and the gruesome way her life had ended, sat heavily on Emma's young shoulders. One night, as Thomas tucked her into bed, she finally spoke. "Dad," she asked softly, "did Mom really love us?" The question hit Thomas like a blow. He sat on the edge of her bed, his heart breaking as he searched for an answer. "Of course she did," he said finally, his voice steady but strained. "Your mom made mistakes, but she loved you and James more than anything. Don't ever doubt that." Emma nodded, but the doubt lingered in her eyes. It was the kind of wound that no words could heal. James, only 9, struggled to process his grief in a different way. Too young to fully grasp the complexity of what had happened, he withdrew into himself, retreating into books and solitary play. He missed his mother terribly but couldn't understand why everything felt so different. He often asked Thomas when things would go back to normal, a question Thomas didn't know how to answer. The town, too, bore the scars of the tragedy. Fairhaven, once a community that prided itself on its closeness, now seemed fractured. Neighbors who had once exchanged friendly waves now avoided eye contact, their conversations laced with suspicion. Catherine's murder had revealed an uncomfortable truth: even in the most picture-perfect lives, darkness could take root. In the weeks following the trial, the Ellsworth family became a symbol of both resilience and scandal. The same neighbors who had gossiped about Catherine's affair now pitted Thomas and his children, though their pity often felt like judgment. Catherine's name was whispered in hushed tones, her memory tarnished by the revelations of her betrayal. But for all the gossip, there was an undercurrent of unease, a sense that if something like this could happen in the Ellsworth home, it could happen anywhere. Jake's parents, Lydia and Michael Reed, also found themselves ostracized. Though they had played no part in their son's actions, they couldn't escape the stigma of being connected to him. Lydia, once a regular at church and community events, withdrew entirely, unable to face the judgmental glances and whispers that followed her. Michael tried to carry on as normal, but even he struggled to maintain his composure under the weight of their family's shame. Despite everything, life in Fairhaven continued. The seasons changed, children went to school, and the townsfolk carried on with their routines. But for Thomas, Emma, and James, the shadow of Catherine's death loomed over every aspect of their lives. Each dinner without her, each holiday, each milestone for the children, every moment was a painful reminder of what had been lost. Thomas often found himself sitting alone in the kitchen late at night, staring at the spot where Catherine had fallen. He thought about what she might have been thinking in her final moments, whether she had regretted her choices or longed for the family she had risked losing. Those questions haunted him, but he knew they would never have answers. Eventually, Thomas began to rebuild, piece by fragile piece. He sought therapy for himself and his children, hoping to give them the tools to move forward. He leaned on the support of his mother-in-law, who, despite her own grief, became a source of strength for the family. Slowly, he started to find a semblance of routine, though the pain never fully left him. Fairhaven would never be the same. The tragedy of Catherine Ellsworth's murder left a mark on the town, a reminder of how easily a seemingly perfect life could unravel. For the Ellsworth family, the road ahead was long and uncertain, but Thomas held on to one truth: they would survive, not because it was easy, but because they had to. Months turned into a year, but the scars of Catherine Ellsworth's tragic death remained etched into the lives of those she had left behind. For the town of Fairhaven, the case had become something of a legend, a cautionary tale of how the veneer of a perfect life could mask deep cracks beneath. But for the Ellsworth family, it was a wound that never truly healed. Thomas Ellsworth, once a man who prided himself on his ability to fix things, found himself grappling with something he couldn't repair. His role had shifted from a provider to a single father, and though he worked tirelessly to hold his family together, he often questioned whether he was succeeding. Every corner of the house reminded him of Catherine, the laughter that once filled the kitchen, the way she hummed to herself while folding laundry, and the warmth she brought to their lives, even in her absence. Despite her betrayal, he missed her deeply. One rainy evening, Thomas sat at the dining table, flipping through an old family photo album. Emma, now 13, joined him quietly. She pointed to a picture of Catherine holding James as a baby, her face glowing with joy. "She looks so happy," Emma said softly. "She was," Thomas replied, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "Whatever mistakes she made, she loved us, Emma. Never forget that." Emma nodded, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. It wasn't an easy truth to accept, but she clung to it, hoping it would ease the pain of losing her mother. James, now 10, still struggled to fully grasp what had happened, but his quiet resilience reminded Thomas that, somehow, they would endure. The house, though filled with memories, began to take on new life. Thomas repainted the kitchen, replacing the once familiar tiles with a fresh design. It was his way of reclaiming the space, of moving forward without forgetting. Little by little, the Ellsworths rebuilt their lives, finding moments of joy amidst the grief. In Fairhaven, Catherine's story became a symbol of both tragedy and introspection. People whispered about her choices, speculating on what could have driven her to take such risks. But as the whispers faded, many began to reflect on their own lives, the relationships they had neglected, the secrets they kept hidden, and the cracks they had chosen to ignore. The tragedy left a lingering question for everyone involved: could it have been avoided? If Catherine had sought help earlier, would she have been able to escape the web of deceit and obsession? If Jake had received the intervention he needed, would his life, and hers, have taken a different path? These questions, unanswered and haunting, served as a reminder of the fragility of human connections. Fairhaven moved forward, as all towns do, but the lesson remained: appearances are deceiving. Behind every closed door is a story no one else can see, a story of love, longing, betrayal, or despair. Catherine's death was a wake-up call, urging people to confront the cracks in their own lives before they spiraled out of control. As for Thomas, his journey wasn't about forgetting Catherine but about finding a way to live with her memory. He taught Emma and James to remember the good in their mother, to cherish the love she had given them despite her flaws. And as they grew, the family discovered a resilience they hadn't known they possessed. On the anniversary of Catherine's death, the three of them visited Little Rock Lake, where her ashes had been scattered. The wind was cool, the water still, and for the first time, Thomas felt a sense of peace, not because the pain was gone, but because they were learning to carry it together. Catherine's story is one of love, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of choices made in moments of weakness. It's a cautionary tale about how easily our lives can spiral out of control when we ignore the cracks in our foundations. What do you think about Catherine's decisions? Could she have avoided this tragic ending? What role did Jake's obsession play in this story, and could anyone have stopped him before it was too late? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe this story could happen in any small town, behind any closed door? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this one. Your perspective matters, and we can't wait to read what you think.